So, welcome to Module 4, which is about cultures and civilizations. And this will be divided into 5 lessons. So, firstly, we're going to discuss civilizations as a unit of historical analysis, meaning that when we talk about patterns in history, we're talking about patterns in the properties and behaviour of civilizations. And then we will discuss origins. Where do civilizations come from? How do they get started? And then we'll move on to the life cycle of civilizations. So the rise and fall of civilizations. And then we'll discuss issues of ideology. So a civilization has a particular worldview, a particular set of ideas about the world. That's ideology. And we'll consider all the theories about ideology, what it is and how it works. And lastly, we'll consider briefly cosmic civilizations. So civilizations in other parts of the galaxy, or as human civilization expands to other planets and other star systems, what are the issues? Cosmic civilizations. So I said in this first lesson we would consider the idea of civilization as a unit of analysis, and this comes from Arnold Toynbee. He said that a civilization is the smallest intelligible unit of historical analysis. Intelligible. So what did he mean by that? Well, suppose we take the history of England. We couldn't really understand properly the history of England without taking into account Scotland and France, its neighbours, because England was often at war with Scotland or France, and its royal dynasties came from there. The Norman kings, came from France to conquer England, and the Stuart dynasty came from Scotland. And there were also other countries that equally interacted in important ways with England that we'd need to consider, like Germany and Italy and Scandinavia. And of course, if we include those countries, then we really need to include their neighbours to understand what their context was. So we'd end up studying really the whole of Europe in order to understand properly everything that's going on within England. So that is the unit that we need to consider. That's European civilization. But we don't need to take into account what was happening with the Aztecs, say, or even what was happening in ancient Egypt, or arguably what was happening in China, at least not until recently. Those are different civilizations, and we don't need to consider them in detail to understand what's happening in England. So the unit of historical analysis is European civilization. We can study that as a whole and as kind of an isolated entity in its own right. Okay, in this first part of the lesson, we're going to consider some basic ideas and definitions to do with cultures and civilizations. And I put up here examples of Aztec art, Chinese art, and ancient Egyptian art. And the point is that you don't need to be a specialist art historian to tell the difference. Each one has a particular style that is instantly recognisable, a particular aesthetic or a particular vibe to it. And that aesthetic or vibe is not just found in the art in each case, but also in things like clothing, what people wore, and in the architecture, and in food preparation, what people ate. And in all these things, this particular aesthetic represents a kind of difference in mental outlook, a different way of thinking about the world. So these are different civilizations, each with a different aesthetic or vibe and a different worldview. And I've talked here about styles, but we could say that there is a kind of a superstyle, because within each civilization you can have variation in style. For example, in Western painting, we've got the old masters and Impressionism and the pre-Raphaelites. Those are different styles, but nevertheless, say they kind of go together. They're kind of instantly recognizable as examples of Western painting. So there is a kind of superstyle that they are part of. And when we have differences in this superstyle or this aesthetic, it means a different civilization. And so if there's a change in the superstyle or a change in the aesthetic, that means a change in the civilization. And so for this reason, some people distinguish the classical civilization of Greece and Rome from Western civilization, because there was a kind of change in the aesthetic, and that reflected a change in the mental outlook, particularly to do with the arrival of Christianity. And some people see the same in China, that they distinguish between the older Chinese civilization, sometimes called the Sinic civilization, and the newer Chinese civilization, sometimes called the Far Eastern civilization. So there was a change in aesthetic and therefore a change in civilization. So there were two civilizations. Okay, we're now going to consider the idea that a civilization is a kind of organism. So on Earth we have life coming in various forms of increasing complexity. Down at a very simple level is the bacterium, and then we have multicellular organisms. This is a fish, so they're divided into organs that work together. And then there are social animals that exist in herds or colonies, or this is supposed to be bees in a hive. And then at the top level is the civilization, which consists of many people interacting in very complex ways. But it is just a very, very complex kind of organism. All of these things are taking in energy and staying alive. Then they're all producing waste products and building themselves and reproducing themselves. So they're all forms of life. But as we go from the simplest to the most complex, there's an increase in the amount of energy going through them. So bacterium has a tiny energy throughput, and a civilization has a humongous energy throughput. And there's also an increase in the number of interacting parts. So, from a bacterium, when we get to cells, we have, as I said earlier, different organs. Then you've got the herd colony divided into many individual entities within it. And then in a civilization, you've not just got lots of people, but you've got also lots of different functions within the civilization, from different economic type factors, different economic functions, different political functions, and so on. But to repeat, a civilization is part of a continuum with other forms of life. It is just an extremely large and complex organism. And one of the features of it then is that it is partly homogeneous. So, for example, Britain, France and Germany are all part of European civilization. So there are certain things that they share in common that make us say they're all part of European civilization. So there's shared properties, there's a certain homogeneity to them, but they're also differentiated so that Britain, France and Germany do have different ways of life, and there are things that they do differently. So the civilization is internally heterogeneous as well. So if your social entity is completely homogeneous, that it has no internal differentiation, then it's not a civilization. A civilization is to some extent internally differentiated, the same way European civilization is divided into the different nationalities within it. On the other hand, if your social unit is completely heterogeneous and there's nothing really in common with the different parts, then again, it's not a civilization. It may be several civilizations, but it's not one civilization. A civilization is kind of somewhere in between. It's partly homogeneous and partly heterogeneous. So one of the implications of this is that a civilization is not politically unified. So a country, for example, is politically unified. It has one government. If there were two governments, then it would be two countries. But a civilization can have multiple countries and multiple governments within it, but still be a civilization because it's got some homogeneity as well as a heterogeneity. Now, for Toynbee, in his model of civilizations that we'll be coming on to, he says that political unification is a stage within the evolution of a civilization. So it's what he calls the universal state, which means that the whole civilization does become politically unified by one part of that civilization, so that conquers the rest, creates an empire. But it's a stage within its life cycle. But it's not, always politically unified. And lastly, we'll consider some of the sources of unification. What kind of things make us say that civilization has some shared properties and so is unified? Well, one thing is the great figures within that civilization who create its aesthetic and style. So, people like Leonardo da Vinci and Shakespeare and Beethoven. These people, through their contributions to the civilization's aesthetic, are recognized throughout the civilization and, give it that unity. But as well as sort of being the people who create the civilization, they're also products of the civilization. And one thing that sort of shows us that they're as much creations of the civilization as the creators of it, is that the great figures often in any particular area tend to come at the same time. So, for example, people like Beethoven and Mozart were living at the same time, or Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, they all were living at the same time, these greats of Western painting. And that's not a coincidence. It shows that, it was the milieu that allowed them to do what they did. So they're kind of produced by the milieu, as well as then creating that milieu. So it's a kind of structure agency thing that these people, these great figures, have agency in defining the aesthetic of the civilization, but there's also the civilizational structure that allows them to be able to do what they do. If they had been born, on a remote island in the Pacific or something, they wouldn't have been able to do those things. So they're products of the civilization, but they also create it. So that's great figures who are recognized throughout the civilization, tend to give it that kind of homogeneity. And another aspect is religion. One that's fairly common sort of rule of thumb of defining a civilization, and that was particularly adopted by Samuel Huntington in his famous book, The Clash of Civilizations, he talked about civilizations in terms of their different religions. So he talked about Western Christianity, so that's European and American civilization, Orthodox Christianity, so that's Russia, Islam, and then what he called the Confucian civilization of China. And he argued that it's these great civilizations defined by their religion that will be sort of the great units of history in the 21st century, and particularly by the name of his book, The Clash of Civilizations, that these differences would be the source of the wars of the 21st century. Okay, now I'd like to say a little bit more about our two key words here, civilization and culture. And there is a sense in which these mean kind of the same thing. They mean kind of sophistication and refinement. So we could say about a person that, this person is very civilized, or they're very cultured. We mean that they're very sophisticated. And the word civilization comes from the Latin civis, meaning a citizen, a city dweller. So it's saying that this kind of refinement is a kind of way of life you encounter in cities, contrasted with, the country bumpkin living in the rustic, way of life. They're not sophisticated, and when they come to the city, they're a bit out of place because they don't know the sophisticated customs and ways of the city. And another word that we sort of might encounter to do with being civilized is being polite, and that comes from the Greek word, just putting it in English letters though, polis, meaning a city again. So it's suggesting that it's in cities that people behave in sophisticated ways. Life is richer and more complex. And then with culture, it means, cultivated. So, educated. It means sort of learning, which makes you sophisticated. And these two words came into English in different ways. So civilization was really the French word for this concept, and culture or Kultur is the German word. And they both came into English, and they've since sort of evolved kind of different meanings. So civilization is kind of a thing. It's sort of, we can almost point to a civilization on a map. It's kind of a tangible thing. Whereas culture is something that you have, culture. So, somebody could adopt Western culture, which you wouldn't sort of say a person could adopt Western civilization, but you could adopt Western culture. But you can be part of Western civilization because that's a thing that you can belong to. And if we then go into sort of culture in a bit more detail, in social anthropology, it's sort of quite famous that there are, hundreds of definitions of culture. So people bandy the word around culture, but they define it in all sorts of idiosyncratic ways. But nevertheless, when you look at them, they boil down basically, or most of them anyway, to the idea that it is learned behaviour, or one feature of it that it's kind of arbitrary. So it's the arbitrary and learned aspects of behaviour that we learn from other people, from our parents, from the society that we're part of. So eating is a human behaviour, and that is something that everybody has to do. But what makes it cultural is that whether we eat, cheeseburgers or witchetty grubs like the Aborigines of Australia. That is something that we learn from other people. And, if somebody's born in one society, they'll learn to eat cheeseburgers and enjoy them. And in another society, they'll learn to eat witchetty grubs and enjoy them. So that makes it cultural. So eating per se is just a biological necessity, but the cultural aspects is sort of how you do it and your ideas about what you're doing. And we can also talk about material culture, which is sort of the tangible products of culture. So things like art and architecture and tools. Those are all material culture, so they can differ from society to society, civilization to civilization. And then there's immaterial culture, which is about ideas and habits and practices that people have, things that you can't see but affect the way they behave. And there's a close connection as well between culture and language. Both are about manipulation of symbols and communication of meaning. So, we understand that very well with language, that words are symbols for ideas, and it's all about communication. But culture is also a kind of a communication mechanism. So if you go to a wedding in Western civilization, or a traditional style wedding anyway, you'll see the bride in a white gown and other people dressed up smartly, and these are sort of cultural ways of doing things, how people dress, which convey meaning about their roles in this event and what kind of event it is. But then if you go to, say, Papua New Guinea, to a wedding there, you'll see people not in white wedding dresses, but maybe with shell necklaces or a bone through the nose or something like that, which is, for them, that is what is dressing up smartly, and that shows who's the bride, who's the father of the bride, and so on. So in both cases, what people are doing is cultural, it's symbolic, it's conveying messages, but precisely how that's done is arbitrary and is learned and is different in the different societies, the same way people have different languages. And so also, like language, it can evolve over time. And sometimes with civilization, it can be used to mean something like just culture. People's civilization is just what they do. And so in this case, you could have, say, Polynesian civilization, or even, Australian Aborigine civilization, or even we could talk maybe about Neanderthal civilization, just meaning the way of life, what they do. So although I said up here that civilization is the kind of behaviour, the way of life that we get in cities, these don't have cities, but people do sometimes talk about Polynesian civilization or Aborigine civilization or even Neanderthal civilization. So you can use it in that sense. But for theoretical historians, civilization, at least as we discuss it in this module on cultures and civilizations, it tends to mean that way of life of cities. So it is about particularly four things that would sort of be thought to mark out, be properties of civilization. Firstly is cities, or particularly networks of cities. So just one city doesn't make a civilization because it's not heterogeneous enough. But a civilization consists of lots of cities interacting. Then writing is another feature to give it that sophistication so that it can produce, you know, complex cultural products. And then an economic surplus. So this is what, you know, differentiates it from the simple country bumpkin life, where people are just, you know, living off the land, and that's the beginning and the end of what they do. In Civilisation, there is economic surplus to invest in things like learning and culture and art that are not, you know, immediately necessary to survival, so they're kind of luxuries, and to pay for those you need some kind of economic surplus. And lastly, there's some non-productive roles. In society, so, you know, kings and priests and artists, people who aren't immediately satisfying survival needs, and, you know, and produce those kind of sophisticated cultural products that make up civilization. And last sort of idea to mention is that of Oswald Spengler that we'll be coming to. For him, culture and civilization represent two stages in the development of what we might call a macrosocial entity. So for Spengler, it starts off as a culture, and at that point it is rural, so there emerges sort of in the countryside a new way of thinking about the world, a new outlook on life, a new set of beliefs and ideas and values, and that then eventually builds cities and moves into the city, and at that point it becomes a civilization. So for Spengler, these are different phases. Culture later becomes a civilization.